Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 18 of Astronomy Geosci 160. We are now on week 11, and we're going to switch to the last portion of our course, which involves looking for life on other planets outside of the Earth. This first segment of Lecture 18 is going to focus on some of the strategies that we'll use when we're thinking about how we might look for life elsewhere. We've learned over the past couple of weeks that life is abundant on Earth, and we've learned about its characteristics. So now we can ask the question, what about elsewhere in the universe? Are there other locations where similar processes may have arisen? Are there other places where there is life that we can find and that we can study and try to understand more how unique we are in this universe? So, the questions that I want to think about in this lecture segment are pretty basic. So, when we're starting to look for life outside of our solar system or outside of our planet, what do we search for? How do we search? What tools do we use? And where do we search? And I'll go through each of these questions right now. So the first one is, what do we search for? And you might think that that's pretty basic, right? If you think that you might look for life, you'll probably know it when you see it. But is that necessarily the case? Here's an image that I'm showing in the background from Star Trek: The Next Generation of a life form that they encounter in one of their journeys. These are space squids or something like that. And they don't look like life that we see. They're not necessarily made of matter. They float in space. They don't live on planets. If we found something like this, or if we saw a signature of something like this, would we even recognize it as life, given our own limited concept of what life might be based on the one example of life we know in the universe on Earth? How can we search for something when we can't even imagine the forms that it might take or the diversity that's out there? It's kind of like asking someone to think about not an elephant. If I ask you to think about not an elephant, what do you think about? There's infinite possibilities. How can you settle on just one or a number of criteria of what a not an elephant is? It's a very difficult problem. So the way that most researchers are working, the tack that most researchers are taking right now, is to start out by looking for life that's relatively similar to what we know on Earth. And practically, that means thinking about two main considerations. So, number one, we're generally thinking about life that exists on the surface of a planet, something like our own Earth. Perhaps that's not necessarily true. Perhaps you can have aliens living in gas giant planet atmospheres where there is no surface, but they just stay aloft. Perhaps you can find aliens living without a planet at all, somewhere out in space. Star Trek has certainly showed many examples of what the writers have imagined could be the case, where you have aliens that live without planets. But this seems like a good place to start at the very least. The other assumption that we tend to make is that liquid water is probably important to life. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, liquids are very good in terms of promoting chemical reactions. The fastest and most interesting chemical reactions happen in the liquid phase. Water is a particularly nice liquid for a couple of reasons. Number one, it can remain a liquid at a relatively warm temperature compared to something like methane. The warmer something is, the faster the chemical reactions will take place in it. It's a polar molecule, and of course, it's the molecule that our life on Earth uses to live. So when we think about life, we generally think that liquid water is an important thing to have. So that's where we will focus much of our resources. But of course, it's important to keep an open mind and remember that we could be completely wrong. We could just totally miss something if we're completely focused on these two criteria that actually is life. So it's a difficult thing to do, but we'll try to keep an open mind while focusing in on these things that we think are likely good indicators of where life may be. Okay, the second question is, how do we search and what tools do we use? There are different ways that we can look for life, and we've already covered a couple of them in class so far. So in the past few lectures, you've seen these images from fossils of old bacteria. So these are some of the early evidence of cyanobacteria on Earth. Here are some more fossilized microbes. Here's a fossilized stromatolite. We can look at these because we can go and take very close-up looks at rocks and put them under our microscopes. That requires us actually going to these places or sending tools or probes to these places. And these measurements, they need to be made in that location. We call this in situ measurements. So you actually go to a place and look for directly the remnants of life or life itself. So like these bacteria here. That's one approach. And generally, it's pretty hard to do because while it's really easy to go somewhere on Earth, you can just take an airplane and hop over to Australia and go to the Jack Hills, deposits. But if you're trying to do this on another planet, the round trip ticket becomes a lot more expensive and a lot more time consuming. So you generally have to send space probes or robots, or you have to send people to the moon and ask them to bring back rocks. That makes it much more difficult to do this. So in situ measurements are very valuable, but they're very hard. The other way is to use remote sensing. This is using images, light, measurements of magnetic fields, stuff like that, from a far distance from the planet, perhaps an orbiting spacecraft around the planet Jupiter or around Mars, or a telescope on Earth or in orbit of Earth that we can point at these other objects. And we can look at the larger properties of the objects. So this is the other way around. If we have to study things that are far away, it's much easier to do it via remote sensing than actually going there in the first place. And there are good ways to think that we could be able to find life via remote sensing. This is a paper that was written by Carl Sagan in the early 1990s. Carl Sagan, of course, is famous for being the host of the Cosmos TV show in the 1980s, which introduced a lot of people to the field of astronomy. But Carl was also very interested in trying to figure out how we can search for life outside of Earth. And one of the ways that he thought about doing it was using remote sensing at spacecraft, doing remote sensing using spacecraft at other planets. So this Galileo space probe was originally launched to go and observe Jupiter and learn about the properties of the planet Jupiter in our solar system. But along the way, it flew near Earth and took images and took data on Earth. And Carl decided to write this paper in which he pretended that having no knowledge of any life on Earth beforehand, could we infer the presence of life from the data collected by Galileo? In particular, can we use, for example, the different signatures of elements when we take data of this planet, when we try to take a spectrum of this planet and see how much light is being emitted at different wavelengths? Can we use this to figure out whether or not there's biological processes happening on Earth? And Carl concluded that yes, there are ways to do this. Compared to a planet that doesn't have any life, Galileo found that on Earth, there was more abundant gaseous oxygen. Oxygen, of course, being produced by many of the plants and algae, such as the cyanobacteria that we have here on Earth today. Carl also found evidence for a widely distributed surface pigment with a sharp absorption edge in the red part of the visible spectrum. So what does that mean? That's a fancy way of saying there's evidence for chlorophyll. You can see in the reflected light of our planet that there is some weird molecule that has a strange spectral pattern, which happens to be chlorophyll in our case, which indicates that there's photosynthetic life happening. Carl also noted the presence of atmospheric methane in extreme disequilibrium. So what does that mean? Methane is a gas that's released by animals, such as cows, in our excrement. And the fact that it's in disequilibrium means that unless there's something rapidly producing lots and lots of methane, like cows, sheep, humans, etc., then it should not be there. There's too much methane to explain naturally. So the fact that there's this disequilibrium, there's more methane than there should be, indicates that something biological is happening. And finally, Carl noted the presence of narrowband pulsed amplitude modulated radio transmissions. So what does he mean by that? He means our radio signals. You can see evidence that there's life on Earth based on our technology. This opens up another debate whether or not we should be looking for biosignatures, which are the signatures of life that are just produced by any life, not necessarily intelligent life or life that's been able to develop technology, versus technosignatures, the signatures that are characteristic of species who've achieved advanced technology and who can, build and modify their environments in different ways. We'll discuss this later on in the course as well. Okay, so now that we've thought about the different tools that we can use, now we can ask the question, where should we look? Where do we search for life? And there's generally one big dividing line, which is we should either look for life within our solar system, in the planets in our solar system, or we should look for life outside the solar system. Of course, we'll try to do both, but how much focus should we put on one versus the other? So there's some pros and cons to each. And it's not necessarily clear which is going to be more likely to succeed, which is going to be the first to find where we'll find life outside of our Earth, and which one will be the most definitive. But here are some of the basic arguments both ways. So if you wanted to argue that I want to search primarily for life within our solar system, there are a few obvious pros. And the most evident one is that it's much easier to study because all of the planets in our solar system are much closer to Earth. So for comparison, we have spacecraft that can travel to all of the planets in our solar system within a few decades. It takes about 6 months to go to Mars. It takes, years to get to Jupiter and further to get to outer planets like Pluto, Neptune, Uranus. So even though the solar system is huge, we have the ability to actually go there and send our robots, send our spacecraft, and potentially even send humans to these locations within the timescales of, an individual human lifespan. When you're thinking about looking for planets around, looking for life on planets around other stars, this timescales become much, much larger. The nearest star to us, Proxima Centauri, is about 4 light years away from us. So if we traveled at the speed of light, we could only get there 4 years from now. And there's our technology is presently just won't let us get anywhere near that speed. Probably it would take thousands or tens of thousands of years with the conventional technologies that we have to get to these additional places if we actually want to go there to these other stars. So that means that we can't actually go there if we want to look for life outside of our solar system. Whereas in the solar system, we can just send a spacecraft, or perhaps we can even send people to go there, pick up rocks, and study those rocks. That's a huge advantage of looking within our solar system. And finally, we understand the history and environment of our solar system well. We've studied it extensively because we know what our environment is like here on Earth. We know what the typical radiation emitted by our sun is and how it's changed over time, and how magnetic activity of the sun has shot solar wind and high energy particles, and how that affects our planet and how that affects the other planets. We just kind of have a better understanding of what conditions were here, and therefore we can understand how life may have interacted with them in a much better way. So those are the upsides to trying to search primarily within our solar system. There are downsides as well. And one of the main ones is that there's just fewer locations to search. There are, 8 or 9 planets in the solar system, depending on what year you were born in. There are 8 major planets. There are 9 planets back including Pluto, but if you want to include Pluto, you should also think about some of the other planets such as Eris, such as Ceres, and others. So at the, in the range of 10 to 20 bodies that are large enough that could have, developed life in the solar system. You can compare that to the billions of stars in our galaxy and the billions of planets that orbit them. There's just much, much more real estate around other stars in our galaxy. And it may be the case that if life only happens to arise in 1 out of 10 places or fewer, that it's possible. There just may not be any life in the solar system to find. And in fact, our initial inspection has shown nothing conclusive. When we've looked for life in the solar system so far, we've never been able to find anything that's been clear signs that there was life anywhere except for Earth. I'll talk about some examples later in this lecture, and we'll talk about some inklings that we have where there may be life in other locations in the solar system that we just haven't found yet. But clearly, there's nothing much like the Earth anywhere else in the solar system. If there was as much life on any of the other bodies in our solar system as there is on the Earth, we would have seen it already. So therefore, it has to be harder to find. So it's this classic idea of easier to find because we can more easily study it, but we're a little bit less likely to succeed because it may just not be there. So this is a good argument for trying to invest in both of these searches, both searching for life within the solar system and searching for life outside of the solar system. And we'll cover both in this course. We'll start off with thinking about the solar system and the potentially habitable locations there are in the solar system. And then we'll start talking about systems outside of our solar system and look for ways that we can try to find alien life outside of our solar system around other stars, despite the more challenging requirements of making those observations.